The back road that cut through the California countryside didn't appear on tourist maps. It was one of those forgotten roads, used only by old trucks, occasional hunters, and locals who preferred silence to perfect asphalt. On a cloudy autumn morning, the noise broke the routine of the place. Tires crushing dry leaves, branches cracking under the weight of a vehicle that definitely didn't belong there. The Ferrari was moving forward slowly, red, or what was left of it. The original paint, typical of the 80s, was covered by a dull layer of dust, moss, and deep scratches. The shine that had once reflected off shop windows and dealership lights now barely managed to pierce the shadows of the tall trees. At first glance, it looked like just another abandoned old car. To those unfamiliar with it, it would go unnoticed. To those who knew, something there was profoundly wrong. Ferraris don't age in the woods. That model had rolled off the assembly line in 1987 in Maranello, Italy, designed for clean streets, closed garages, and watchful eyes. It was a car made to be displayed, cared for, and idolized, not to slowly rot among roots, insects, and constant dampness. And yet there it was. The protagonist of this story wasn't looking for a Ferrari. He wasn't looking for any car at all. His job was different, mapping private forest areas that had been abandoned by bankrupt companies in the 1990s, forgotten plots of land after lengthy and poorly resolved legal proceedings. Areas where the state didn't reach, and where the former owners no longer cared. What he found that day wasn't documented in any records. The first sign was metallic, a strange reflection among the trees, caught by chance when he strayed from the main path. Something too geometric to be natural. As he approached, the smell changed. It wasn't just wet earth and leaves. There was old oil, degraded rubber, rust. When she moved the branches aside, the silence seemed to deepen. The front of the car was partially sunk into the ground, as if the forest was slowly trying to swallow it. The Ferrari emblem was still there, though corroded. The prancing horse was barely distinguishable under the dirt, but it was unmistakable. The headlights, opaque, resembled blind eyes staring into nothingness. There were no visible signs, no immediate signs of forced entry, no broken glass. The doors were locked. The car didn't appear to have been dismantled, vandalized, or looted, unusual for a vehicle abandoned in the United States for so long. This raised a disturbing question. Why hadn't anyone touched him? The car's position indicated it hadn't been pushed. It had been driven there. Carefully, intentionally. There were no skid marks, no signs of an accident. Whoever left that Ferrari in the middle of the woods wasn't fleeing from something immediate. They were carrying out a decision. Decades earlier, in 1987, that same car had traveled completely different streets. Hot asphalt, bustling cities, gas stations lit up at night. Factory documents indicated a clear destination: export to the United States, a booming market where status symbols were worth as much as performance. The antagonist of the story doesn't emerge as an obvious villain. He exists in the gaps, in the silent decisions, in the records that cease to make sense after a certain point. The central conflict is not just who abandoned the car, but why would anyone hide a symbol of success of that magnitude and never come back to retrieve it? Around the Ferrari, the environment seemed frozen in time. Trees grew around the chassis, roots pushed against the underside of the vehicle. Small animals had made nests near the wheels. Nature showed no hurry, only constancy. Each year added a layer of oblivion. Inside the car, the interior remained surprisingly intact. The leather seats were dry, but whole. The steering wheel was still aligned. The dashboard displayed numbers that weren't just technical data. They were silent witnesses to a final journey. The odometer showed mileage far too low for a car over 30 years old. That wasn't an old car, it was a broken-down car. There were no signs of a struggle, no personal belongings left behind. Nothing to explain the sudden abandonment, just the unsettling feeling that this Ferrari had been taken from the world at the peak of its existence, as if someone had decided to erase a part of their own life. The conflict began there. Between what that car represented, luxury, power, victory, and where it ended up, isolation, silence, oblivion. And the question that arose was not simply automotive curiosity, it was something bigger. What happened to cause a 1987 Ferrari to end up alone, hidden in the middle of the American woods? And why has its story never been told until now? In the United States, stories of abandoned cars are not uncommon. Barns hide forgotten muscle cars. Deserts hold military prototypes, and sealed garages reveal entire collections decades later, but that Ferrari didn't fit into any of those familiar narratives. It wasn't protected. It wasn't locked away. It wasn't waiting for someone who would one day return. She had been withdrawn from the world. The region where the car was found had a peculiar history. In the 1980s and early 1990s, that area of California had attracted investors from outside the state, businessmen involved in real estate, transportation, and import-export. Many became rich quickly, others disappeared just as fast. Companies opened and closed within a few years, names that appeared in records and vanished without leaving a clear trace. It was the kind of place where money circulated faster than explanations. The protagonist began cross-referencing data out of professional obligation, but soon the interest ceased to be purely technical. Property records showed that the land had belonged to a holding company that went out of business in 1994. Before that, the area had served as a secondary access road to an old private road, used by trucks and high-value vehicles that avoided main routes. Nothing illegal on paper, everything suspicious in context. The Ferrari became more than just a curious find. It became an anomaly. Consulting import records, the first relevant detail emerged. The car had been officially imported in 1987 by an intermediary company based in Los Angeles. There was no record of a direct sale to the end consumer. The buyer's name never appeared in common public records, only an internal code, typical of transactions made for clients who preferred discretion. In the 1980s, this wasn't uncommon. Executives, artists, financial market entrepreneurs, many used shell companies to acquire high-value assets, but almost all left enough traces to reconstruct the story. That Ferrari, however, was different. It existed up to a certain point, and then it disappeared. The antagonist was beginning to take shape not as a specific person, but as a set of decisions. Someone who had access to the car, the resources to maintain it, the knowledge to hide it, and yet still chose to abandon it instead of selling, dismantling, or destroying it. This eliminated common assumptions. It didn't look like a robbery. A thief could have dismantled the car in weeks. It didn't look like a financial escape. An asset of that value would have been liquidated quickly. It didn't look like an accident. There were no signs of impact or obvious mechanical failure that would justify its permanent abandonment. The situation pointed to something more delicate. The car needed to disappear, but it couldn't be destroyed. Meanwhile, the surrounding environment reinforced the strangeness. The woods weren't dense enough to completely hide anything, but they were far enough away to ensure that no one would stumble upon them by accident. It was a temporary hideout that became permanent through neglect, not long-term planning. The secondary characters enter silently. A former resident of the area, upon seeing aerial photographs of the location, vaguely recognized the period. He commented that in the late 1980s, it wasn't uncommon to see very different cars passing by at night, vehicles that didn't fit in with the place. None of them stayed, none of them returned, even that one. Another detail came to light when examining the car's interior more closely. In the glove compartment, there were no documents, no manual, no service records. Just old dust and an empty compartment, as if someone had made sure to remove everything that could connect the vehicle to a specific identity. But the car wasn't designed for complete oblivion. The original radio was still there, tuned to an AM frequency. A trivial detail, except for the fact that that specific station had ceased broadcasting in the early 90s. The last use of the car, or at least the radio, had occurred before that, an involuntary temporal marker left behind. The protagonist's past also began to influence his interpretation of the situation. He wasn't just a technician or researcher. He grew up in a family connected to classic cars, where stories of abandoned vehicles were always accompanied by unresolved human stories. For him, vehicles weren't just machines, they were records of choices, and that Ferrari was a record that was abruptly interrupted. The antagonist, still faceless, was taking on psychological contours. Someone who valued the car enough not to destroy it, but who needed to distance themselves from it permanently. Someone who made a cold, planned decision without haste. This explained the absence of damage, the careful positioning, the closing of the doors. It was a silent goodbye. The historical context reinforced this interpretation. In 1987, the United States was experiencing the height of a culture of excess. Quick money, status, risk. But it was also a period that preceded investigations, financial collapses, and lawsuits that followed in subsequent years. Many names disappeared before questions were even asked. The Ferrari, now covered by vegetation, looked like an artifact of that time, a piece of a larger game, left behind when the cost of maintaining it became too high. The world of the story wasn't just the forest. It was the contrast between the brilliance of the 80s and the silence that followed, between exposure and oblivion, between the desire to be seen and the need to disappear. And the further the protagonist progressed, the clearer an unsettling feeling became, that Ferrari wasn't lost. It was hidden, and the reason had not yet been revealed. The discovery of the Ferrari ceased to be merely a curious find and began to generate almost immediate practical consequences. Aerial photographs, technical reports, and field notes began circulating among state agencies, private companies, and classic car specialists. And the more qualified people looked at the car, the less consensus there was about what should be done with it. The first conflict arose outside the forest. There were clear rules regarding abandoned goods on private property, but this situation didn't fit well into any category. The car wasn't officially registered as scrap. There was no theft report associated with the chassis number. It also wasn't listed as seized or recovered property. Technically, it was a high-value item with no known owner. That in itself was already problematic. Experts who analyzed the images quickly recognized the model and year. It wasn't an ordinary Ferrari within the Ferrari universe. Produced during a specific period, it carried features that had been altered or abandoned in subsequent years. Certain details of the chassis, suspension, and mechanical components made that car rarer than its worn appearance suggested. The rarity increased the value, the price increased interest. The increased interest heightened the risk. The protagonist realized he had crossed an invisible line. People who previously didn't care began asking questions. Some were technical, others too vague. They questioned who had found the car, where exactly it was, if it had already been removed, if anyone had touched it. None of these questions came with clear answers. Meanwhile, the car remained there, exposed to an environment that was slowly destroying it. Each week in the woods meant more corrosion, more degradation, more loss of originality. The pressure mounted. Remove the Ferrari quickly or lose a significant part of its history. But removing it also meant something more. It meant bringing her back into the light. The conflict deepened when inconsistencies emerged in the few existing records. A partial chassis number appeared in an old database associated with a company that had officially never imported vehicles. Another document indicated an internal transfer that was never completed. Nothing was definitive, but everything pointed to a deliberately fragmented history. The antagonist, still unseen, seemed to have done a careful job. The protagonist began to feel that he wasn't just dealing with the past. There was a growing unease, as if the story wasn't completely over yet. There were no direct signs of threat, but there was too much silence. and silence in that context was not reassuring. Secondary characters added new layers to the conflict. A classic car restorer declined to comment publicly on the case after a brief private review. A well-known collector showed excessive interest in acquiring the vehicle as is without demanding documentation. A lawyer specializing in historical assets warned of potential legal disputes if the car were removed without a formal decision. Each interaction made the situation more complex. The protagonist was faced with a choice that didn't exist at the beginning. Treat the car as a technical object, removing it quickly, or confront the possibility that this Ferrari was linked to something that someone still preferred to keep buried, literally and metaphorically. The forest, once just a backdrop, became an active part of the conflict. More intense rains began to hit the region. The ground gave way a little more under the weight of the car. A small landslide displaced branches and exposed part of the undercarriage. It was a silent countdown. Nature was advancing, bureaucracy was causing delays, external interest was exerting pressure, and amidst all of this, the car remained motionless, as if resisting any human decision. The protagonist returned to the location several times. Each visit reinforced the feeling that the abandonment had been calculated. There was no improvisation. The car had been positioned so as not to attract attention from the main road, but it also hadn't been permanently hidden. It was a temporary hiding place that had become permanent due to unknown circumstances. This raised a disturbing new hypothesis. The original plan may never have been completed. Perhaps someone intended to return. Perhaps something prevented this return. The protagonist's internal conflict grew as he realized the scope of the story. It was no longer about preserving a rare vehicle. It was about deciding whether certain stories should be unearthed or left exactly where they were. The Ferrari, in its metallic silence, seemed to carry more than just rust. It carried hasty decisions, poorly explained riches, and a disappearance that was never officially recorded. And the further the protagonist progressed, the clearer an uncomfortable truth became. That Ferrari wasn't just an abandoned car. It was a loose piece of a past that someone had tried to erase, and that was now beginning to resist. As the days passed, the Ferrari story began to unfold in layers that went far beyond the car itself. Each new piece of information didn't solve the mystery, it only made it more complex. What had previously seemed like an isolated case now revealed subtle, almost invisible connections to people, interests, and decisions made decades ago. The first subplot emerged from a seemingly irrelevant detail: the type of modification found in the exhaust system. It wasn't original factory equipment, but it wasn't a common adjustment either. It was a discrete adaptation made to reduce noise without completely compromising performance. Something that wouldn't interest the average enthusiast, but would make sense for someone who wanted to drive around discreetly. This changed how the car read its position. The Ferrari hadn't just been bought, it had been adapted to go unnoticed. Another layer emerged from the parallel market for luxury vehicles in the 1980s. During that period, it was common for exotic cars to be used as informal collateral in private agreements, undocumented loans, or negotiations that never resulted in official contracts. A car like that could circulate among people without ever appearing in clear public records. This opened up an uncomfortable possibility. The last owner may never have been officially the legal owner. Meanwhile, the pressure from the weather was mounting. The forecast of heavier rains in the following weeks put Ferrari at real risk of irreversible structural damage. The ground was already showing signs of instability, and experts warned that if nothing was done, parts of the chassis could deform under their own weight. Nature would not wait for human decisions. A new subplot gained traction when discreet rumors surfaced on specialized forums. Photographs of the car, even blurry ones, began to circulate. People with technical knowledge recognized details too specific to be coincidence. Comments appeared and disappeared quickly. Some users deleted their own messages minutes after posting them. There was interest. There was caution. There was a fear of exposure. An important supporting character entered the scene at this point. A former importer of European vehicles who worked in the United States in the late 1980s. He recognized the pattern of incomplete documentation and stated, without going into detail, that this type of omission was usually not accidental. According to him, when a car disappeared like that, it was because someone had paid for it to disappear, not to be destroyed, but to be withdrawn from circulation. This information didn't solve anything, but it reinforced the weight of the original decision. Another complexity arose from the protagonist's own emotional state. As the story gained visibility, he began to realize that his role had changed. He was no longer just someone recording an unusual find. He had become the central point between past and present, between silence and exposure. Every choice now had consequences. If he removed the car without clear authorization, he could face lengthy legal disputes. If he left the car where it was, he risked losing it to time, or to someone willing to act without permission. If he disclosed too much, he would attract interests that were perhaps better avoided. If he withheld information, he would be repeating the same pattern that had led Ferrari to that point. The conflict was no longer merely external, smaller subplots intertwined with the main arc. A technician who participated in the initial inspection asked not to have his name associated with the case. A public official informally suggested that certain findings weren't worth the trouble. A foreign collector offered immediate logistical assistance without asking questions. None of this was explicitly illegal, but it all carried a clear subtext. The past didn't want to be stirred up. The forest in turn continued to advance, branches pressed against the metal body. Small animals roamed freely inside the vehicle. The constant humidity began to affect sensitive points on the body. It was as if the environment was slowly erasing the last human traces from that object. And this created a powerful contrast. While people debated ownership, value, and risk, nature simply followed its course. The subplots converged on a central question that still had no answer. What exactly happened between the moment that Ferrari left the dealership and the instant it was last turned off in the middle of the woods? Every detail pointed to an abrupt interruption, unplanned until the very end. Something had happened after the car was hidden, something that prevented any attempt at return, recovery, or sale. Time pressure reached its peak when a technical report indicated that, if not removed soon, the Ferrari would lose structural features that made it unique. It wouldn't just be a damaged car, it would be an unrecoverable legacy. The protagonist realized he was approaching a point of no return. The previously scattered subplots now aligned. External interests, documentary gaps, discrete modifications, deliberate silence, the advance of nature. Everything pointed to a decision that needed to be made, and quickly. The story was no longer about discovering the past. It was about what to do with it. And at the center of it all, motionless, silent, and shrouded in shadows, the Ferrari remained as an unsettling testament that some stories don't disappear. They just wait for the right moment to resurface. The decision to remove the Ferrari was not taken impulsively. It was driven by a series of small events that individually seemed manageable, but together created an insurmountable pressure. The most recent report indicated that a new rainy season could definitively compromise the floor. It was no longer a matter of aesthetic preservation, it was structural. But the real turning point didn't come from nature, it came from a number. During a closer inspection, carried out before any attempt at removal, one detail went unnoticed for weeks, a discreet, almost invisible marking on an internal area of the engine compartment. It wasn't part of the factory standard. It wasn't a common maintenance mark. It was a short, incomplete code, engraved manually. That number shouldn't be there. When the code was cross-referenced with old import files and private insurance records, an unexpected connection emerged. The pattern matched a system informally used by high-value insurers in the 1980s to identify assets involved in unresolved disputes. Not ordinary thefts, sensitive disputes. Cases where the vehicle legally existed, but its ownership was tied to ongoing investigations or broken settlements. It was a waiting list that changed everything. The Ferrari hadn't been hidden away simply by personal choice. It had been put on hold, an asset frozen in time, waiting for a resolution that never came. And someone at some point decided that the risk of bringing it back was greater than the loss of abandoning it. The antagonist, previously vague, was gaining more defined contours. Not necessarily a classic criminal, but someone involved in a situation that had become too dangerous to be resolved conventionally. Someone who had the time, resources and access, and who chose silence as a strategy. The emotional turning point came almost simultaneously. While cleaning part of the interior, a forgotten detail appeared under the passenger seat, a small object, of no apparent value, but laden with meaning. An old metal keychain bearing the name of a European dealership that had closed down back in the 90s. It wasn't direct proof, but he was human. The car ceased to be just a frozen asset. It became part of a story interrupted by something bigger than financial decisions. Someone had used that Ferrari, cared for it, planned to keep it. And something happened along the way. The conflict escalated abruptly when a formal request arrived demanding the immediate suspension of any removal attempt. Its origin was vague. It didn't come from a specific body, but cited possible international legal implications. No deadline, no clear instructions, just a warning. It was the kind of message that didn't need much explanation to be effective. At the same time, an informal offer emerged. Too high to ignore, too low to be honest. Buy the car as scrap. No investigation, no questions, no public exposure. Solve the problem quickly. End the story. This coincidence did not go unnoticed. The pressure reached its peak. On one side, the irreversible degradation of the vehicle. On the other, invisible forces trying to keep everything exactly as it was. And in the middle, the protagonist, now fully aware that any choice would redefine the course of the story. The turning point wasn't the discovery of the code. It was not a legal request. It wasn't a suspicious offer. It was the understanding that did anyone still care about that Ferrari? Not out of nostalgia, not for historical value, but because its existence, intact, silent, and forgotten, still represented a risk. An unbroken link to a past that should remain buried. The final decision came in silence, without announcement, without disclosure, a choice that shattered expectations on all sides. Instead of acting quickly or retreating completely, the protagonist opted for a third path, a move that no one anticipated and one that would definitively change the course of the story. The Ferrari would not be removed immediately, but it wouldn't remain invisible either. Something was about to come to light, and from that moment on, there was no turning back. What had been hidden for too long was finally beginning to emerge. The decision not to immediately remove the Ferrari logo had almost instantaneous effects. What was once a contained mystery began to generate chain reactions, many of them silent, others too explicit to ignore. The simple change of posture, neither fully exposing nor hiding, altered the fragile balance that had kept that story dormant for decades. The first consequence came from the system. Authorizations that previously took weeks were now being suspended without explanation. Administrative processes were left under review. People who used to respond to emails quickly now limited themselves to generic messages when they responded at all. It wasn't a formal blockade, it was something more subtle, a calculated cooling off. It was resistance. At the same time, external interest grew. Classic car experts began to publicly speculate about the model's identity. Each detail revealed generated new theories. Some got technical points right. Others were completely wrong. But they all had something in common. They attracted too much attention. Ferrari was no longer invisible. The most revealing reaction came indirectly. An intermediary made contact, without identifying themselves as representing anyone specific. They didn't threaten. They didn't demand anything. They simply suggested that certain stories don't need to be complete to be true. It was a clear attempt to steer the narrative before it formed on its own. This confirmed something essential. There was a fear of interpretation. Meanwhile, the car continued to suffer the effects of time. Moisture had advanced into critical areas. Parts of the interior were beginning to show signs of structural collapse. Each day it was out of service represented an irreversible loss. The Ferrari was caught between two risks, the risk of being exposed and the risk of disappearing altogether. The protagonist's emotional reactions began to intensify. The professional distance he had initially maintained became difficult to sustain. He was no longer dealing merely with a rare object. He was dealing with the consequences of choices made by people who were never held accountable for them. And now, someone needed to answer. Secondary characters also reacted in different ways. A restorer changed his position and began to advocate for immediate removal, fearing the definitive loss of the vehicle. A lawyer warned that inaction could be interpreted as negligence. A public official let slip in informal conversation that certain names preferred that the matter lose momentum over time. None of this was explicit. Everything was implied. The most serious consequence, however, was internal. The realization that any decision made from then on would not be neutral. There were no more safe choices, only choices with different costs. Preserving the car meant exposing stories. Letting the car disappear meant collaborating in its erasure. The tension spread to the environment as well. The site began receiving unauthorized visitors. Recent footprints appeared near the car, tire tracks in areas where there had previously been no traffic. Nothing was taken, nothing was touched, but the message was clear. The isolation was over. This sped everything up. The protagonist realized that time, once a silent ally, had become an active enemy. Each delay increased the risk of external intervention, whether legal, clandestine, or opportunistic. History was being pulled out of the woods, whether anyone wanted it or not. The more subtle reactions came from the automotive community. For many, the Ferrari symbolized something greater than rarity. It symbolized an era in which excesses were normalized and consequences postponed. The car became an uncomfortable mirror of a past that many preferred to remember only for its brilliance, not its shadows, and that explained the widespread unease. The conflict now escalated due to pressure, not curiosity. The question was no longer, what happened? It was, what will be done now? The lack of answers created space for versions, speculations, and decisions made by third parties. At the center of it all, the Ferrari remained motionless, silent, vulnerable, as if awaiting the outcome that had been denied it for decades. It didn't react, but everything around it reacted because of it. The consequences piled up, relationships became strained, interests clashed, and a certainty began to form with unsettling clarity. History had gone beyond the point where it could be controlled. Any further step would push events into definitive territory. There would be no more suspense, no more waiting. The next move would determine whether that Ferrari would be remembered as an extraordinary find, or as something that almost came to light but was lost forever. And for the first time since the discovery, the protagonist understood that he was no longer just deciding the fate of a car. I was deciding how that story would end, or if it would end at all. From the moment it became clear that inaction was no longer an option, the protagonist was forced to change his course of action. Until then, He had tried to balance technical prudence with institutional caution. Now, this balance proved unsustainable. The Ferrari case demanded a stance, and a stance always comes at a price. The first change was practical. He stopped treating the car merely as an object to be catalogued and began to see it as a historical record at imminent risk. This completely altered his priorities. Instead of waiting for vague authorizations, he initiated a formal, independent documentation process, recording every detail of the vehicle with almost obsessive precision. It was an act of preservation, but also of resistance. This attitude marked the beginning of an internal transformation. The protagonist came to accept that pleasing everyone was impossible. If someone was bothered by the gradual unfolding of the story, that was no longer a sufficient reason to back down. The fear of making mistakes began to be replaced by a clearer commitment, not to allow silence to be the outcome again. Overcoming the challenge didn't come from one grand gesture, but from a series of consistent decisions. He assembled a small team, chosen not based on hierarchy, but on trust. People who understood the car's historical value and the weight of its implications. No public announcements, no sensationalism, just method, precision, and technical transparency. This move provoked immediate reactions. Some old contacts distanced themselves, others made their discomfort clear. But curiously, unexpected support emerged, professionals tired of seeing stories buried for convenience. The protagonist's growth became visible in how he handled the pressure. Where there was once hesitation, now there was clarity. Where there was once silence, now there was documentation. Every step was thought out, not to please, but to resist being erased. The car, in turn, began to respond silently. By carefully removing layers of dirt and vegetation, marks emerged that reinforced the vehicle's uniqueness. Small factory imperfections, manual adjustments, details that only existed in units produced in specific batches. Ferrari was no longer a generic mystery, it was becoming an individual. This realization deepened the protagonist's emotional connection to the story, not a sentimental attachment, but a sense of responsibility. He understood that Ferrari had survived by chance, not by protection, and that now it depended on conscious choices to avoid disappearing permanently. Growth also manifested itself in the ability to accept risks. Instead of trying to eliminate all variables, the protagonist began to work with them. He knew that conflicting interests existed. He knew that not all reactions would be favorable, but he also knew that continuing to retreat would only benefit those who wished for oblivion. One of the most significant moments of this phase occurred during a solitary visit to the site. For the first time since the discovery, he felt not only tension, but clarity. The forest no longer seemed like an oppressive hiding place, but a reminder of lost time. The car, still motionless, seemed less a problem and more a testament awaiting resolution. Personal growth was solidified there, ceasing to react to fear and beginning to act with purpose. This didn't mean recklessness. It meant acknowledging that some stories demand confrontation, that preservation isn't just about physical protection, but ensuring the context isn't erased. That growing up, in that case, meant accepting that neutrality is also a choice, and almost always the most convenient one for those who want nothing to change. The protagonist also began to communicate better, no longer trying to control all interpretations, but offering clear, verifiable information without sensationalism. This strengthened his position. The more transparent he became, the less room there was for veiled pressures. The Ferrari, now partially documented, was beginning to emerge from its status as a vulnerable object and assume a new one, proof. Proof that the past had not disappeared. It had simply awaited someone willing to bear the burden of bringing it back. This growth phase culminated in a silent but definitive decision. The next step would no longer be defensive. It would be to move forward. Not to directly confront those trying to keep everything hidden, but to create a situation where erasure would no longer be a viable option. The story would be driven to a point where it needed to be resolved, one way or another. The protagonist knew this would lead to the final confrontation, and for the first time, he didn't try to avoid it. The decision to move forward changed the pace of everything. Time, which previously seemed to drag on amidst authorizations and analyses, began to run against everyone involved. Every move by the protagonist triggered immediate responses, and the Ferrari story ceased to be something controllable and became inevitable. The first step was to resolve what was still unresolved. Subplots that had previously run in parallel needed to be closed before the main conflict became irreversible. Incomplete documents were finally cross-referenced with international archives. Fragmented records, previously considered irrelevant, began to form a clearer pattern. The name of the intermediary company reappeared, now linked to an old lawsuit that was closed without a formal conclusion. This lawsuit involved atypical financial transfers and high-value assets held outside the traditional financial circuit. Ferrari appeared as a mentioned item, but was never located. She should never have been found. At the same time, external interests were reorganizing. People who had previously acted indirectly began to position themselves more clearly. There were no open threats, but there was urgency. Suggestions became requests. Requests became veiled warnings. It was a sign that the space for negotiation was closing. The protagonist remained focused. He avoided premature revelations. Instead, he concentrated on preparing the ground for an inevitable outcome. Every technical detail of the car was recorded. Every modification, every mark, every inconsistency in relation to the factory standard became part of a solid dossier. It wasn't just about paperwork, it was about protection. The Ferrari gradually ceased to be an isolated object in the woods and transformed into a formally recognized case. This created an important side effect. The more official its existence became, the harder it was to simply make it disappear. The human subplots were also resolved. The restorer, who had previously hesitated, was now committed to preservation. The lawyer, once cautious, began working with controlled exhibition scenarios. The civil servant, who had hinted at discomfort, withdrew from the case. Each piece fit perfectly. External pressure intensified silently. People began to appear more frequently in the vicinity of the site. They didn't invade, they observed, they assessed. It was a constant, discreet, but undeniable presence. The isolation that had protected Ferrari for decades had dissolved. The surroundings reflected this change. The forest seemed more open, less protective. The makeshift trail to the car was more marked. The hideout had lost its original function. The time for secrecy was over. The protagonist felt the weight of what was to come. There was no more room for strategic retreats. The story had moved too far forward. Any attempt to pause now would sound like a concession. The preparation wasn't just technical, it was emotional. He needed to be ready for the moment when everything came to light, including information that might not confirm all suspicions, but that would still change public perception of the case. The Ferrari, in turn, seemed to resist its own wear and tear. Despite the accumulated damage, its structure remained surprisingly intact. It was as if the car had been made to survive waiting, an artifact created in an era of excess, now awaiting judgment. The pace quickened when the last missing piece emerged, a document forgotten in a physical file, never digitized, which mentioned the transfer of a European sports car as part of a deal that was never finalized. The identification number was incomplete, but the details matched too closely to be ignored. It was confirmation that Ferrari was part of something bigger. The final confrontation wouldn't just be about possession or value. It would be about responsibility, about who chose to hide it, who benefited from the silence, and who would now have to deal with the consequences of the exposure. The preparation was complete. The routes were defined. The risks were known. The next step would allow no further adjustments. There would be no way to control all the reactions. The climax would not be an isolated event, but a moment when everything would converge: documents, interests, past and present. And at the center of it all, about to finally emerge from the shadows, was the 1987 Ferrari, property owned for decades, silent for convenience, now ready to be revealed. The moment arrived without ceremony. There was no countdown, official announcement, or prior warning. The revelation began in the same way the discovery had happened, silently, almost discreetly, but impossible to ignore once it had begun. The convoy entered the area at dawn. It wasn't large, but its precision was remarkable. Utility vehicles, containment equipment, portable lighting, and people who clearly knew exactly what they were doing. Nothing there seemed improvised. The forest, which for decades had been complicit in the secret, now watched its unraveling. The protagonist watched from a distance, aware that this was the last moment the Ferrari belonged solely to that place. In a few minutes, it would cease to be an isolated mystery and become an event. When the makeshift covering was removed, the impact was immediate. Even covered in dirt, dry moss, and the marks of time, the silhouette was unmistakable. The lines drawn in Maranello in 1987 were still there, low, aggressive, elegant, completely out of context in that wild setting. It was as if two incompatible worlds collided before everyone's eyes. Silence filled the room for a few seconds. Experienced professionals, accustomed to handling historical finds, stood motionless, not out of doubt, but out of recognition. This was no ordinary car. It was a genuine, rare Ferrari from a specific era of the brand, known for its limited production and murky history. The documentation began immediately: high-resolution photographs, measurements, preliminary structural analysis. Every detail was documented as proof not only of existence, but of authenticity. And then came the first real shock. The partial chassis number, corroded by time, was still legible enough to confirm something many suspected, but no one had said aloud. That car was not officially listed as destroyed, exported, or auctioned. It had simply disappeared. That changed everything. As the technical team progressed, external repercussions began almost simultaneously. Information leaked, not through carelessness, but because it was too late to contain it. A Ferrari car, manufactured in 1987, was found abandoned in a wooded area in the United States, in surprisingly well-preserved condition. The story exploded. Experts were consulted urgently. Former industry employees began to speak out. Collectors recognized specific details that confirmed the model's rarity. Forums and specialized networks went into a frenzy. But the biggest tension was yet to come. Hours later, the first legal representatives emerged, claiming an interest in the vehicle. None of them asserted direct ownership. They spoke of historical ties, property interests, and possible derivative rights. It was a cautious, strategic dispute, fraught with implications. The protagonist watched everything attentively. He knew that this moment wasn't about defeating anyone, but about preventing the truth from being buried again under silent agreements. The Ferrari was removed from the site with extreme care. Every meter traveled outside the forest seemed symbolic. The car, which had remained invisible for decades, was now escorted, protected, and observed. When it reached the controlled space for in-depth analysis, the second impact occurred. Beneath the accumulated dirt, the original paint still existed. Worn, dull, but intact enough to reveal the exact color it had left the factory in. A specific, extremely rare shade, associated with a special order. This detail connected the car to a name. Not just any name, but someone linked to controversial deals from the late 1980s involving parallel imports, asset diversion, and international contractual disputes. Someone who officially never owned that Ferrari, but he clearly ordered it. Tensions reached a peak when the final document was presented to the authorities. proof that the car had been deliberately removed from legal circulation to avoid confiscation during an investigation that was ultimately shelved due to lack of evidence. The Ferrari had been hidden, intentionally. The climax wasn't a heated argument or a dramatic scene. It was the moment when all the pieces fell into place before everyone's eyes. There were no more plausible alternative versions. The story was complete. The estimated value of the car, now confirmed to be extremely rare, skyrocketed instantly. But curiously, that became secondary. The real impact was in the narrative. The 1987 Ferrari had ceased to be merely a valuable object. It had become a symbol of how decisions made behind the scenes in the automotive industry could remain silent for decades until they were finally exposed. The protagonist knew that, from that point on, nothing would be under his control anymore. The story would follow its own course. Further investigations would be opened, names would be mentioned, official versions would be revised, and the public would finally have access to something that should never have been forgotten. The Ferrari was out of the woods, out of the silence, out of the past. But its consequences were only beginning. After the climax came the silence. Not the silence of oblivion, but the kind that arises after an impact too great to be processed immediately. The Ferrari was no longer in the woods, but the echo of its discovery still reverberated everywhere the news had reached. The car now rested in a controlled environment, far from the dampness, soil, and roots that had disguised it for decades. Under constant white light, every detail seemed even more timeless. It wasn't just an old vehicle, it was a frozen fragment of a specific era in the automotive industry, with all its excesses, ambitions, and secrets. The investigations proceeded cautiously. There was no rush, but there was attention to detail. Everything involving that Ferrari needed to be handled with surgical precision. Any mistake could compromise not only the car's fate, but also the credibility of the entire process. Independent experts were called in. Ferrari historians, certified restorers, lawyers specializing in automotive heritage, and even former industry executives participated in the analyses. Each brought a different piece of the puzzle, and gradually a consensus began to form. The 1987 Ferrari was not an isolated case. It was the result of a system that allowed extremely valuable goods to circulate outside the law, protected by informal agreements and grey areas of international law. The car had not been forgotten, it had been strategically abandoned. The final outcome began to take shape when it became clear that no one could claim it without facing serious legal consequences. Those interested, who had previously come forward with vague speeches, began to back down. Some disappeared completely from the radar. For the first time in decades, Ferrari was free from ulterior motives. The remaining decision was what to do with it. There were three possible paths, and all carried historical weight. The first option was a complete restoration, bringing the car back to its original state as if it had just rolled off the factory floor in Maranello. A long, expensive, and extremely delicate process. For many, this would be a way to correct the past. The second path was preservation, to keep the Ferrari exactly as it was found, with visible marks of time, wear, and imperfections, not as a functional car, but as a historical artifact, physical proof of everything that had happened. The third was the most controversial. A public display accompanied by the complete story without any embellishment, not just showing the car, but exposing the system that allowed it to be hidden for so long. The decision was not immediate. Meanwhile, the public reaction continued to grow. Videos, analyses, theories, and comparisons flooded the internet. The Ferrari began to be called by nicknames: the Lost Ferrari, the Ghost of '87, the Ferrari of the Forest. Each name reinforced the myth, but the protagonist maintained a firm stance. He knew that the biggest mistake would be to turn it into mere empty entertainment. The strength of the story lay in the truth, and it needed to be preserved. When the final announcement came, it surprised even the most skeptical. The Ferrari would not be fully restored. It would not be sold. It would not disappear again. It would be preserved and displayed. The car would undergo a minimal structural stabilization process, just enough to prevent future deterioration. Nothing would be fixed aesthetically. No scars would be erased. Every scratch, every mark of corrosion, every sign of the passage of time would remain visible. Next to the car would be the complete story. Documents, photos, timelines, and clear explanations of how and why that Ferrari ended up hidden in the woods for decades. No excessive romanticization, no caricatured villains, just facts. The exhibition's opening was discreet, but the impact was enormous. People stopped in front of the Ferrari in silence. They weren't just admiring the design or the brand, they were admiring the improbability of its existence. A supercar created for speed, luxury, and ostentation, parked for decades in the most unlikely place possible. Ferrari had ceased to be a status symbol and had become a symbol of memory. Experts began to cite it as one of the most important cases in modern automotive history. Not for its financial value, although it was very high, but for what it represented, the materialization of decisions made away from the public eye. The protagonist watched everything with a mixture of relief and respect. He knew that this story would never be completely finished. There would always be new questions, new interpretations, but the essential had been done. The Ferrari was visible. The story was recorded. The silence had been broken. And perhaps that was the true outcome. Not a closed ending, but a turning point. A reminder that even the best-kept secrets can one day emerge, intact enough to tell their own story. The 1987 Ferrari never returned to the streets. He never returned to the tracks. But he returned to the world. Years later, the Ferrari was still there, motionless, silent, observed by people who never imagined seeing something like it outside of a racetrack or a millionaire's garage. Children pointed, adults read every detail attentively, experts remained silent for long minutes. The forest had tried to swallow that machine, but failed. Time tried to erase it, but only transformed it into proof. The Ferrari was no longer just a car. It was a warning. Some stories don't disappear, they just wait for the right moment to be found. If this Ferrari managed to survive time, silence, and oblivion, how many other stories are still hidden out there? Lost cars, erased decisions, machines that hold secrets no one has told. If you enjoy true stories, improbable discoveries, and the hidden side of the automotive world, this channel is for you. Leave your comment, share your theory, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story that time tried to hide but failed.